to APUSH. I don't know if I did that right or not. Let's get ready to rumble. Let's see. I don't know. Trying to be funny. I think I fell flat. All right, so this is now my fourth lesson for period 4. This one's on Jackson and the rise of the Democratic Party. And there's some interesting things hopefully we'll get to and talk about here about Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson. This might go a little long, so I apologize for that. So our key concept here is 4-1, Roman numeral 1, letter C now. Here's where they introduce to us the two new parties. The Democrats, remember, they were part of the Jeffersonian Republicans. They eventually became Democratic Republican. And it's when Andrew Jackson becomes president that this name really begins to stick. Henry Clay is also a Jeffersonian Republican. He will become a national Republican. But after the first 4 years of Andrew Jackson, eventually Clay will begin to realize that he needs a stronger opposition party to Jackson. And he and Daniel Webster and other men of their time period will gather together and create a new opposition party, mostly to Andrew Jackson, not just the Democrats, and they call themselves the Whigs, taken from an England during Great Britain Revolutionary period. Ask me about in class. We can talk about that in class. I don't want to spend time here. Again, what are they fighting over? Well, the same things they've been fighting over since, well, forever. National bank, tariffs, internal improvements, because Henry Clay is all about the American system. And that is something that Jackson's not really about. And Jackson begins to look at Clay as an enemy. And once that happens, poor Clay. Let's just say poor Clay. So when I left you last time in the era of good feelings, dun, 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 the corrupt bargain has taken place. 1824. That's the election where there were 4 men actually running for this election. All of them Republicans. Right? You had William Crawford from Georgia. You have Henry Clay, pictured up there on the left, from Kentucky. In the center, you have John Quincy Adams from Boston. And you have the general himself, Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Now, Clay never, ever hid the fact that he did not like Andrew Jackson. He would often say, how does killing so many British soldiers qualify a man for the highest office in the United States? He had always gone on record of not really liking the guy. And remember, we talked about this in class. Jackson, when he was a general, would often overstep his orders and do things that were a little bit shady. I'm looking at you, Florida. Looking at you. Well, this election starts to take place, and Clay realizes with 4 men running, there's no way you're going to get a clear winner in the Electoral College. And we've already gone through this once before with Thomas Jefferson in 1800. When there's no clear winner in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he's very well liked. So Clay begins to realize with a 4-man race, I have to come in third because the top 3 go to the House, and the House then makes the decision. I'm the Speaker of the House. I'm very well loved. Very easy for me to become President of the United States. So he thinks. As this election takes place, you got to imagine Clay, and this is where Clay gets his reputation of being a conniver, maybe a schemer, because he's constantly adding up electoral votes from various states. He feels he's got a lot of friends in Louisiana and in New York, obviously Kentucky. He should get just enough votes to get in third. And then to help make matters seem even easier for Clay, William Crawford of Georgia suffers a stroke. Oh, wow. I mean, I'm not making fun of that at all, but for someone like Clay, he was like, wow, I mean, that's terrible for Crawford, but That's good for me. No one's going to vote for someone who's obviously in terrible health. I'm destined to come in third. Well, what starts to happen? Well, a series of misfortunate events, as they like to say. See, Clay knew that even though that Jackson was the hero of New Orleans, he still had strong support, that is Clay, amongst many politicians and political elites in Louisiana. So he thought he would easily carry the state. Well, he finds out that 2 of his supporters were absent the day to cast votes, so he didn't get Louisiana. Then rumors began to spread that Clay had actually dropped out of the race because it was probably Clay that had the stroke and not Crawford. Some of his supporters also began to cast votes for other candidates. Ultimately, the entire state of Louisiana went to Jackson. Well, I won't say the entire state. Jackson got the 3 main votes, and Adams got 2. Clay got nothing. All right, well, I'm going to win New York. After much debate and compromise and bargaining, the legislation assigned 25 electoral votes to Adams, 7 to Clay, and 4 to Crawford. But when the electors actually reported to cast their ballots, half of Clay's were actually absent, or they decided to switch to another candidate. In the end, it turned out 26 electoral votes for Adams, 5 for Crawford, only 4 for Clay, and 1 for Jackson. To win that magic number of 131 electoral votes, Clay wasn't going to come anywhere near it. When it all is added up, it turned out that Adams came in first with electoral votes, Jackson came in second, Crawford, the man in very poor health, comes in third, and Henry Clay came in last. Oh man, Henry Clay, seriously, dude, how is it you can just exist, right? It's so sad, all these things that happened to him. I know I was eventually going to get that from somebody. How about another little aw? Yeah, poor Clay. Well, Clay, well, he'd rather probably be a kingmaker, as sometimes he would say. Now, this is where the corrupt bargain kind of comes in, where now it still has to go to the House of Representatives, and the House is going to have to vote between Jackson, Quincy Adams, and Crawford. Jackson believes he still won the majority of those electoral votes, and the first time ever you count the popular vote, Jackson won the popular vote. He is the man of the people. He is the candidate of the man. You cannot rob me of this election. And the House is going to vote. And the House is going to nominate John Quincy Adams for President of the United States. Well, how could this have happened? I've been robbed. There is some shenanigans going on here. How could this have possibly happened? Well, people began to snoop around and try to figure out, well, what actually took place. And they begin to find out that at some point, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams had a little dinner date where nobody else was there. Now, to his dying day, Clay is going to swear nothing happened. These 2 men have known each other for a long time. They were the guys that went to Ghent to sign the peace treaty to end the War of 1812, so they already knew each other. Adams had kind of gone on record that he never held any ill feelings towards Clay, but he clearly never really liked Clay either. But Jackson's going to use this opportunity to say these 2 men went into a dirty deal, a corrupt bargain, and they robbed the people of their choice, which was me. And he is going to carry that grudge against these men forever. When everyone got to meet after the election is going to go Quincy's way. There's going to be, obviously, one of those little parties are going to happen, the inaugural ball. And Quincy Adams and his wife is there, and Clay is there. And in walks Andrew Jackson. And everyone's wondering what is happening here. Jackson walks up and he's got a beautiful woman on his arm. And he walks up to Henry Clay and he walks up to John Quincy Adams and he says, "How do you do, Mr. Adams?" Very cheerfully. Then he looks at Adams again and he says, "I would give you my left hand, for my right, as you see, is devoted to the fair. I hope you are very well, sir." Now, obviously, to the fair, he's referring to the young lady on his arm, but it's also a play on words. Fair. You are not a fair man, Mr. Quincy Adams. You robbed me. And that's going to tell the tale of what's going to happen in 4 years. Jackson is going to come back, and he's going to run for election again in 1828. And this time, he is going to crush John Quincy Adams. This was a brutal, nasty election. They begin to hurl insults at each other. They'll declare that John Quincy Adams was a pimp. I had told you at one point he had gone to Russia, or he was negotiating with the Russians to make sure that they did not claim land on the West Coast. Well, the Democrats claim that he sent his niece over there as a prostitute so that to give the czar favor. So they were starting to call Quincy Adams a pimp. Total lie. Well, they declared, when I say they declared, Quincy Adams' camp said that, well, your wife, Rachel, is a bigamist. She married 2 men at the same time. That kind of turned out to be true. That was one of those things that nobody thought anybody knew. When Jackson and Rachel were very young, right, he had met Rachel, and she was married to another man who didn't treat her right. She's also older than Jackson. They did fall in love. They found out that this guy was treating her wrong, so he said he would get a divorce, but he leaves. And the two of them, they're in Tennessee, but they go down to Mississippi to get a quickie marriage. And people, to this day, people don't even know if it was a real marriage or not. They get back only to find out that her first husband did not get the divorce. And immediately everything swirled around them. Oh my goodness, she's married to 2 men. That's against the law. This guy showed up. He comes back and he starts making all kinds of threats against Rachel and against Jackson. You don't make threats against Jackson. Let me just tell you that. You don't make threats against this man. And he will basically let the other husband know, you had better get your divorce. Jackson goes and divorces Rachel. Then he made sure the other guy divorced Rachel. And then Jackson remarries her. The only president to marry the same woman twice. But that happened in the 1790s. They were young. They thought no one knew this. Look, in politics, everyone finds out about what you've done or what you didn't do. Jackson tries to hide this from Rachel. Throughout the election, he won't let her read newspapers. Well, he wins easily, and she winds up going to Nashville to start dress shopping with friends to go to Washington for the inaugural ball. She stops in a coffee shop. She wants to look at a newspaper, looks at a Cincinnati newspaper, and there it is. Rachel Jackson, married to 2 men. It shocked her. She faints. They end up taking her home. Jackson was still out campaigning in another county when he finds out that Rachel is very ill. He rushes home. Rachel dies of a massive heart attack. This is going to be one of those things that's going to cloud the thinking of Andrew Jackson for 8 years. At the funeral, and I'm paraphrasing this, but he says that I know God forgives, but I can't. And he's going to have #1 enemy in his sight is Henry Clay. He's going to believe that Henry Clay is the one that put that in the newspaper. There is no proof of that, but it doesn't matter. Jackson comes to the White House angry, mad, right? This is the beginning that they call in our key concepts as well, the rise of mass democracy. So it used to say that Jackson helped promote this. He did not. He just rode the coattails of the fact that every average Joe now could vote, and he used that to help him win an election. He preyed upon people's fears and their angers and said, I'm the guy for you. Now, remind me in class about the spoils system so I can talk to you about that in class, but that is party patronage. We talked about that with Thomas Jefferson. How do you keep your party together? It changes. Jackson didn't call it spoils system. His enemies called it spoils system. So remind me in class, and I'll go in a little more detail with that with you there. Let's look at this knucklehead, by the way. This is John C. Calhoun. I told you he's a werewolf. Look at those eyes. Look at that hair. Calhoun. Steely eyes. Don't you mess with me. I'm from South Carolina. He was a guy, by the way, in that first election, that 1824 one, he also was going to run for president, realized he couldn't win, and said, I'll just be everybody's vice president. So he was the vice president of John Quincy Adams. Then in 1828, he said, well, I'll just stay vice president. And he became the vice president of Andrew Jackson. What a world we live in at that time period. Tariffs are a problem for the South. As I've been telling you, they are a problem for the South. When Quincy was still president, the Jacksonian Democrats pushed through a bill to raise the tariff, hoping it would hurt the Adams administration because he signs it. But by the time it comes into play, he's already lost the election, and now Andrew Jackson inherits the tariff, a very high tariff that the South called the tariff of abomination. You raise tariffs in an unprotected world, and these cotton plantation owners have to trade their cotton to Europe, and now they got to pay high tariffs. Cuts into their profit. Well, as tariffs are going up, so are the cost of price of goods and services. You don't manufacture anything in the South, so everything you're buying in the North, prices are higher there too. Cuts into your profit. This was always a way that the Southerners saw that the North was trying to ruin their life. Go back to that Missouri Compromise. We talked about that before, right? The idea that the North's policy of manufacturing, industry, trade is going to run contrary to their agrarian, cherished way of life. And eventually, it's going to lead to them taking away slaves. So what does John C. Calhoun do? Well, he remembers back in 1798, the good old Thomas Jefferson himself attacked John Adams and his Alien and Sedition Acts. And he did it with the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. And in the Virginia resolution, actually I think it's the Virginia resolution, is where Jefferson outlines the idea of compact theory. Trying to help remind you, hopefully you remember this, Jefferson talks about the original 13 states and an agreement, a compact, created the Constitution. Thereby the states are far superior to the Constitution and the federal government. And they can nullify law if they don't like it. And this time, that was the Alien and Sedition Acts. They never went beyond a resolution. But here we are 30 years later. And John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, is going to write a pamphlet. Ooh, a pamphlet, I tell you. Called the South Carolina Exposition. And he's going to outline how you have dishonored the South with these tariffs. You have agitated us for so many years. You are clearly not caring anything about our society. We can nullify your law. We will not have any tariffs at our ports whatsoever. They will be duty-free. And if you don't like the fact that we're going to nullify that law, we will secede from the Union. Secession. I said secession, sir. Now, he kept it a secret. He didn't put his name to the South Carolina Exposition, but everybody knew this was him, including Andrew Jackson now. And that's his president. He's the vice president. But he calculated that, well, Jackson's a slave owner. I'm a slave owner. Jackson is a Southerner. I'm a Southerner. He's going to side with me. The problem is he didn't tell Jackson he was doing it. If he probably had gone to Jackson, who knows? All of a sudden, Jackson, who supposedly is a states' writer, once he sees what South Carolina is going to do without his permission, that becomes, now I'm a Unionist. I will defend the Union. And he will threaten to burn South Carolina to the ground. And I mean, he will do it. For 4 years, the first 4 years of this man's presidentship, the nullification crisis will consume this country. South Carolina is on an island, as it were. They think that other southern states will come to their help, but they won't. On April 13th, 1830, is the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birthday. Now, he's been dead for 4 years at this time period. They still want to acknowledge his birthday. So they're going to hold this big party at this Indian Queen Hotel in Washington, D.C. Jackson was invited, but he will famously say, it was a nullification crisis altogether. And he's angry. So he spent several days thinking of a toast. Right? That's why it's known as the famous toast. He does come, and he's hearing all of these toasts. And I'm going to quote from one of my favorite books here from John Meacham, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. And here he says, at the Indian Queen, the room was crowded with politicians as Robert Hayne and others rhapsodized about the greatness of Jefferson's glorious stand against John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts. The implication was clear. It was time to recover that anti-federalist spirit, to undo the tariff and secure slavery. At last, it was Jackson's turn to toast. Martin Van Buren, who we're going to talk a lot about here coming up soon, who was seated across the room, climbed atop his chair to take a good look at the scene. The words that had come to Jackson in the morning now produced a gasp at the Southerners and their nullifiers. And this is what Jackson toasts. Our Union, it must be preserved. Silence. Calhoun then rose to speak. The vice president interpreted Jackson's toast as a direct threat to the cause of the South. Calhoun says, the Union, next to our liberty the most dear, may we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and distributing equally the benefit and the burden of the Union. The gauntlet was down. A few days later, a friend of Jackson's came in to see him, and he said he was heading to South Carolina, and would he like to bring any words? And Jackson says, yes, I'd like you to bring some words down to the people of South Carolina, that if one man down there stands in opposition to the Union and sheds 1 ounce of blood, I will go down there with full force and hang the first person I get my hands on by the first tree I see. The President of the United States is now threatening war and personal vendetta against anybody who stands up against him. This country is disintegrating. Well, enter Henry Clay. Henry Clay remembers that John C. Calhoun and he used to be friends back during the War of 1812. And he convinces Calhoun, who will quit as vice president and regain his seat in the Senate, that we can work together on a compromise that is good for you, good for me, and it makes Jackson look bad. And became the compromise tariff of 1833. We'll slowly lower the rates over the next 10 years to get it back to what it was in 1816. And everybody said yes to this. But Jackson was furious. He said, I'm going to sign this, but I also want a force bill. He tells Congress to grant me permission to use force. If I want to use force against any state, I can raise armies, raise navies, and I can do it. To make Jackson happy, they passed the force bill. This again, I told you, Clay becomes known as the Great Compromiser. This is now the second one he's got. We have a third one yet to come. Let's also talk a little bit about Peggy Eaton and a sexual scandal, if you will. Put these up here. This woman, Margaret O'Neill Timberlake Eaton. Right? She was Margaret O'Neill. Her nickname is Peggy. She married a Mr. Timberlake. They're bringing sexy back, I guess. I don't know. This guy Timberlake, John Timberlake, was in the U.S. Navy. He's what's called a purser. He's the guy that handles all the money on a ship. So when a ship comes into a port in Jamaica, in the Mediterranean, somewhere in Europe, and sailors want to get off, and do what sailors do, they need their money, you go see the ship's purser. He holds all the money, and he gives you your pay so you can get off the boat and do stuff. Well, he mysteriously dies in 1828, commits suicide. Enter John Henry Eaton, who swoops up Peggy and marries her on January 1st, 1829. John Henry Eaton was a family friend of Andrew Jackson. The Eatons and the Jacksons lived very close to each other, knew each other for generations, very close friends. It didn't really matter the fact that Peggy was probably pregnant with John Henry's child at the time, that Timberlake more than likely received a letter from somebody that your wife is pregnant. He did the math and realized it was impossible for him to be the father, and instead of confronting, he committed suicide. Well, this became a major sex scandal because John Henry Eaton is going to be appointed Secretary of War under Andrew Jackson. And when he comes into Washington, D.C., gossip is all over the place, and nobody will socialize with these people. This is the one battle Jackson will never win. He will try to force everyone to socialize with the Eatons, but they just won't do it. They became known as the Peggy Eaton affair. It also will consume everything about him. The other thing is, the guy that took the place of Timberlake, John Randolph, we're going to talk about him. A Lieutenant Randolph disgrace is about to happen. We're going to do a whole little lesson on this in class. John Randolph will Jackson to try to get people not thinking that this was a sex affair. He will declare that John Randolph and John Timberlake were stealing money from the Navy, and that's why Timberlake killed himself. And to prove it, he dishonorably discharges Randolph. He ruins his military career. That's Jackson, right? No proof whatsoever, but he doesn't want anyone to say anything bad about the Eatons, so he ruins another man's career. This is a pretty big deal taking place at that time period. And like I said, we're going to do a little fun little thing in class about honor, about dueling, and about nose pulling. That's coming, and it's going to come all the way back around to this Peggy Eaton affair. Well, it's 1832. Would you vote for Andrew Jackson? He's up for re-election. I killed the bank. Andrew Jackson. The autobiography of Martin Van Buren. Oh boy. Henry Clay is now going to run for election again. He's going to have his second time running for election. And the bank becomes the issue. In the mid-19th century, the national bank is the source of all credit and stability in this country. The economy was strong. But in order to do this, it does do things that made people angry. Out in the West, a lot of farmers were speculating and they weren't able to pay their mortgages. So the bus orders a lot of foreclosures on Western farmers. That is a stronghold of voters for Andrew Jackson. Always remember that. The Western farmers support Andrew Jackson. And Jackson is not happy with this. But remember, this bank has a 20-year charter. We talked about this. 1791 to 1811 was the first one. They decided, we're not bringing it back. Then the War of 1812. Then they said, well, let's bring it back. They brought it back in 1816. So it should exist to 1836. But Clay has an idea to win an election finally. The economy is strong. Let's tell the bank to come before Congress now and ask to renew the charter now, because 1836, Jackson won't be running again. Let's prove to America that the president knows nothing about the economy. So Clay makes this an election issue. Goes before Congress, and Congress agrees. Not completely. There's some shenanigans that go on there too, but they pass a renewal charter bill. And on July 4th, it goes to the desk of Andrew Jackson. to sign it. And his famous veto now. He will veto the recharter bill. Now, Jackson's not much for writing, but whenever you veto something, you have to write an essay explaining why you're vetoing it. So he has a friend of his, a guy named Roger Taney. We're going to want to remember that name, Roger Taney. Oh, Roger Taney. Roger Taney helps him write this veto message, and it's a rambling piece of something. He blames that the bank has become a monopoly, and it hurts people. It allows for foreign investors, and foreigners are coming in and basically taking over our country, and it will eventually allow itself to influence our democracy and steal elections from us. And Clay read that and it's like, oh my goodness, this guy really doesn't know anything. So Clay helps to get this thing published so that people can read it and see that the president doesn't know anything. But most Americans don't know anything. And they read monopoly. Well, we can't have a monopoly in our government. Foreigners, we can't have foreigners taking over our government, stealing our election. We got to vote for Andrew Jackson. And what Clay thought for sure was going to get him elected got him destroyed in the election of 1832. I mean, it was awful. Jackson now wins, and he believes he has this mandate from the people. All right? He's declared the bus unconstitutional. By the way, that's what we call the Bank of the United States, the bus. He's vetoed the charter bill. And like I said, he calls it a monopoly, controlled by foreigners, hurts the people. Clay saw this as, oh my goodness, the American system is now under attack. People love the American system, right? No, it didn't turn out people didn't even really know what Clay was always talking about. They just knew that Jackson hated the bank and Jackson hated Clay. That's all we needed. Clay is trounced, just beat. I like these political cartoons. Right? These are both anti-Jackson cartoons. The symptoms of a locked jaw. That's Henry Clay kneeling over an old sickly Jackson and he's sewing his mouth shut. You might also take notice that he's kneeing him in the groin, basically implying that Jackson is so old he's impotent. And then this is probably one of the more famous ones over here with Jackson as a king. You'll see this often on the AP exam. The veto is in his hand. He's dressed like King Andrew I. He's standing on a tore up constitution. And Jackson is just wielding his power like a king. These are great political cartoons. It didn't help Clay, though. Did not help Clay. The people love this guy. And they say, he don't like the economy? Let's get rid of the economy. And that's basically what's going to happen. Jackson's not going to wait for 1836. Right? You denied the charter, but the bank is supposed to still stick around till 1836. You're denying its right to renew in 1832. So the bank was like, well, okay, we'll just wait till 1836 and start all over again. No, not Jackson. Jackson begins to order that the number one depositor of the bank is the federal government. All that tariff money, all the excise taxes on whiskey and other things, it all goes into that bank. Well, Jackson is going to order his Secretary of the Treasury to stop doing that. His Secretary of Treasury is going to tell him, Mr. Jackson, that's against the Constitution. Only Congress can do that. Well, he fires his Secretary of the Treasury. Then he gets another one in there. And he tells him, you're going to go into the bank, you're going to take out all our money, and we're going to stop putting money in the bank. And that guy says, Mr. President, that's against the Constitution. He doesn't actually fire that second one as much as he tells him time to think about it. He still says it's unconstitutional. Then he says, okay, you're no longer Secretary of State. I'm going to fire you, but I'm going to move you to another position in government and get you out. Then he remembers, oh yeah, Roger Taney. He helped me write the bank veto. Would you like to be the Secretary of Treasury? And he's all, yeah. Good, you're the Secretary of Treasury. Will you help me take the money out of the bank? Yeah. Boom, they start taking the money out of the bank. This is unconstitutional. Again, another president doing something he should be impeached for. Happens all the time, people. Happens all the time. Nicholas Biddle is the president of the bank, and he's freaking out. He tries to call in all the loans of all the people that have invested, try to save the bank, and it doesn't work. They wind up firing him as the president, and the bank goes bankrupt. It just dies. Jackson comes up with a great idea. Let's put all the money, instead of into the national bank, in all the state banks. The ones he calls pet banks, the ones that are loyal to Jackson. And out west, there's all these new banks called wildcat banks. So the federal government starts putting all its money in these state banks and newly created western banks. And these banks don't know what to do with the money. And they begin to invest in it wrong, and they begin to do other wrong things. And then 4 years go by, and Jackson's not going to run for a third term. He's going to handpick a successor, Martin Van Buren, and America's going to go into an even greater depression than the one in 1819. All because you destroyed the Bank of the United States. Thank you, Jackson. Thank you for this. His face is on a $20 bill. Go figure. By the way, as I end this, take a look at this. Where in the world is Mr. Linhart? Try to figure out if you think of where you know where I'm at, because this is going to be the basis of a classroom lecture we're going to do in class. Be thinking about it. See everybody later.